King and pawn endings are important. They are the most important sort of ending. This is because every other ending is a potential king and pawn ending. In order to play endings with pieces on the board, you must first learn how to play them without the pieces, so that you know whether to exchange them. Very often, piece endings are decided by the king and pawn ending without the pieces ever being exchanged. For example, if you are in a rook and pawn ending, and you know that the exchange of rooks will give you a 1 king and pawn ending, you have a considerable advantage, because your rook can chase your opponent's rook around the board. The fact that your opponent can't allow the rooks to oppose each other makes your rook a stronger piece than his rook. But unless you can correctly assess the effect of exchanging pieces, you won't be able to play endings with pieces on the board, because you won't know whether to exchange them or not. As well as being the most important sort of ending, king and pawn endings are also the easiest endings, but often not as easy as they look, and you can easily be caught out if you're not careful. So the purpose of this tape is to make sure you are aware of the main principles involved in king and pawn endings, and if you listen carefully and study the examples given, you should be able to cope with most practical king and pawn endings. Now let's get started on some actual positions. First of all, we must be quite clear about king and pawn against king. Have a look at diagram 1. That's right, there aren't any pawns. What I want you to do is to consider the possible squares a white pawn could be placed on, and to decide which of them will give white a 1 position, and which of them will lead to a draw. Confine yourself to the 3 central files, the queen file, king file, and king bishop file. Stop the tape now and think about this. Have you thought? Well, if you haven't made up your mind about every case, you'll have a chance to stop and think about each one as I come to it. First, let's put the pawn on king 6. Suppose it's black to move. Which square should he move his king back to? Well, you probably know the answer to that one. He should move it to king 1. Then, if white plays king to queen 6, black plays king to queen 1, white plays pawn to king 7 check, black plays king to king 1, and now it's a draw because white can't keep next to the pawn without playing king to king 6, which is stalemate. Go back to the diagram with the white king on king 5, black king on king 2, and the pawn still on king 6. What would have happened if he had moved his king back to queen 1 or bishop 1 instead of king 1? Let's try king to queen 1. Now white plays king to queen 6. Black must play king to king 1. White plays pawn to king 7. Black has only one move, king to bishop 2. And now king to queen 7 by white enables the pawn to queen, and so white wins. You probably knew king 1 was the right square for black to move the king to, but do you know why? There is a simple concept which enables you to tell easily which square to move to without having to stop and work it out. This is called the opposition. To explain what's meant by this, forget about the pawn for the moment. Look at the position in diagram 1 without the pawn, just the 2 kings facing each other. Now, whoever it is to move must give way and allow the other king to move forward. For example, if black is to move, he must allow white to play either king to queen 6 or king to bishop 6, because he can't move his king to a square which covers both of these squares. So, in this case, white is said to have the opposition, and this concept is very important in king and pawn endings. Put the pawn back on king 6, and now we can see why the king moves back to king 1. because then white can't keep the opposition by playing king to king 6 because his own pawn is in the way. Instead, he must move to either queen 6 or bishop 6, allowing black to gain the opposition by moving opposite him. Having understood about the opposition, you will find it much easier to understand all sorts of king and pawn positions. I'll be mentioning the opposition quite often in the rest of the tape. Now let's go back to diagram 1 and see where else we can put the pawn. What about queen 5? Now let's suppose it's black's turn to move. If he plays king to queen 2, white has only one way really of making any progress. He plays pawn to queen 6. Now we're back to a similar sort of position to the one we had just now, and black must play his king back to queen 1, because white then can't play king to queen 6, keeping the opposition, and so again it's a draw. So let's go back again to the diagram. White king on king 5, black king on king 2. So we've seen that with the pawn on queen 5 it's a draw, and it doesn't really make any difference whose turn it is to move. So let's move the pawn back another square. Let's try putting it on king 4. Now this time it does make a difference whose turn it is to move. Suppose it's black to move first of all. He moves his king to the side. Let's suppose he moves it to queen 2. Now white can play king to bishop 6. Because he has the opposition, he's able to force his king in like this, and he's now threatening king to bishop 7, after which the pawn would have a clear run through to queen. So in order to try and keep controlling the king file, black must move his king back to king 1. But now white again keeps the opposition by playing king to king 6. Again the black king has to move to the side. Let's suppose he moves it to queen 1. White plays king to bishop 7, and now black can't control the king file. If he plays king to queen 2, white plays pawn to king 5, and the pawn just goes straight through and queens. So how did that start off? That was with the kings in back on white king on king 5, black king on king 2, and with the pawn on king 4, and it was with black to move. Now supposing it's white to move instead, again he obviously moves his king to the side. Let's suppose he moves it to queen 5. But now black can keep the opposition by playing king to queen 2. White's only way of making any progress now is to push the pawn up to king 5. But black plays his king back to king 2. And we've got back to a position similar to one we've had already, which is a draw. So that demonstrates that with the pawn starting off on king 4, it depends whose turn to move it is, and if white has the opposition, he wins. If he hasn't got the opposition, he draws. If the pawn is on another square on the 4th rank, supposing it's on queen 4, the effect is very similar. Again, it just depends whether you've got the opposition or not, whether it's a win or a draw. Now let's try moving the pawn back yet another square. Let's put it on king 3 or queen 3. Let's say king 3. Now white always has a spare move with his pawn, which he can use to gain the opposition if he hasn't already got it. So because of this, it doesn't make any difference whose turn it is to move. White plays in exactly the same way as before, except that if he hasn't already got the opposition, he uses up a pawn move in order to get it. And you can check this out for yourself if you want to. And if the pawn is back any further on king 2 or queen 2, of course it's just the same. So to summarise, the answer to the question I asked originally is set out in diagram 12. Have a look at that. I don't suppose you will have looked at that one yet. In this diagram, the kings are in the same position as in diagram 1. The Ds represent positions where the pawn could be, which would lead to a draw. The question marks are where the pawn could be so that it would depend whose move it is, whether it's a win or a draw, and the Ws indicate that it's a win if the pawn's on one of those squares. The results are the same whichever file the pawn is on. You could move the kings and the pawn to the side to a bishop file or a knight file. It still wouldn't make much difference, except in the case of the rook file. If the pawn is on the rook file, all the black king has to do is to just sit in the corner, and he can never be driven out. If the pawn advances up to rook 7, it's stalemate, so that's an easy draw. You can test that for yourself if you want to. Before we leave king and pawn against king, there's one other principle I'd like to introduce. Set up the position in diagram 2. Stop the tape while you do so. Not very difficult, you may think. It's just a question of whether the black king can catch the pawn before it queens. You can easily work that out. If it's white's turn to move, the pawn can't be stopped. But if it's black's turn to move, the king can get back and catch the pawn. The point I wanted to make is that there's an easy way to work out whether the pawn can be caught. You imagine the pawn and the queenie square to be two corners of a big square. If the black king can step into that square, he can stop the pawn. If he can't step into it, the pawn queens. So in diagram 2, the position we're looking at, the four corners of the square are white's queen's rook 8, queen's rook 5, queen 5, and queen 8. If it's black to move, the king can step into that square on either white's queen 5 or queen 6, and so he stops the pawn. If it's white to move, the pawn moves up to queen rook 6. And now the square has become smaller. Its corners are now on white's queen rook 8, queen rook 6, queen bishop 6, and queen bishop 8. And the king can no longer step into that square, so the pawn can't be stopped. This principle of the square can save you effort in lots of more complicated king and pawn endings, because whenever there's a race on between a pawn and a king, you can tell who wins easily without having to count up the moves. You just use the concept of the square and just see whether the king can step into the square of the particular pawn it's trying to stop. Now let's go on to king and two pawns against king. This is always a win, unless one of the pawns can be taken immediately, or unless the pawns are doubled rook pawns. If the pawns are doubled on any other file instead of the rook file, of course you can always gain the opposition by using up a move with the black pawn, so that's no problem. A common situation is shown in diagram 3. Stop the tape and set this up. How does white win? Well, of course, he just brings his king over to support the pawns. Two connected passed pawns like this are often useful for tying down the opposing king. The back one, in this case the knight pawn, can never be taken because then the other one queens. Quite often you get to a position like diagram 3, except that there are more pawns of both colours on the king's side. The black king is tied up by the two queenside pawns, and the white king can charge around mopping up pawns on the king's side, providing none of them are protected passed pawns. Now let's have a look at diagram 4. Stop the tape and set this one up. White is to move. Is this a win or a draw? Stop the tape and have a think about it. Yes, it's a win. Again, white just has to bring his king up to support the pawns. If black attacks either pawn, the other one moves up one square. For example, if black plays king to rook 3, white plays pawn to bishop 6. And now black can't take the rook pawn because the bishop pawn queens, and so he can't really do anything. Even if he's got time then to move the king back to knight 1, white then just plays pawn to rook 6, and we've got the same position but with the pawns one square further up. So the black king can never take the pawns, and so he just has to wait while the white king moves up to support them. Two pawns on the same rank like this have much the same effect as the two connected passed pawns in diagram 3. They tie the opposing king down, thus freeing the white king to do what he likes on the other side of the board. Now let's come on to positions with king and 2 pawns against king and 1 pawn. Normally this is a win. Frequently you can arrange to exchange a pair of pawns so as to leave you with a 1 king and pawn position. But of course that's why you have to know which king and pawn against king positions are 1. Also, quite often you can drive the opposing king back and win his last pawn. Now set up the position in diagram 5 and stop the tape and think about it. This is a fairly finely balanced example of king and 2 pawns versus king and 1. Here white has no passed pawn and no spare pawn moves to gain the opposition with. If the queen pawn were on queen 6 instead of queen 4, for example, the supported passed pawn would give white an easy win. Or if the bishop pawn were still on queen bishop 4 instead of bishop 5, white could keep pawn to bishop 5 in reserve in case he needed to gain the opposition. As it is, however, the position is quite close. With black to move, is it a win or a draw? Stop the tape while you decide this. Well, white has the opposition, so it's a win. Let's suppose black moves his king back to king 2. Now white plays king to king 5, keeping the opposition. Black tries to keep protecting the pawn, so he plays king to queen 2. Now white plays king to bishop 6. And there's no way that the black king can stop being driven back. If he plays to bishop 2, for example, white then comes into king 7, and again the black king has to move across to knight 2, let's say, and then white plays king to queen 7 and wins the pawn. So if black defends like that, it's quite an easy win. Stop the tape and return to the original position. if black plays king to bishop 3 instead, then white just plays pawn to queen 5, and this gets into one of the king and pawn against king positions, because white can get his king in front of the pawn, and as long as you can get the king in front of the pawn and gets the king over to knight 7, then that will be a win. So instead of playing king to bishop 3 by black, let's, from the original position, supposing he plays king to queen 2. Now if white plays the obvious king to king 5, then black plays king to king 2, and now black has gained the opposition. So white doesn't want to allow that. So after king to queen 2 by black, instead of king to king 5, white plays king to bishop 5. And now he's got what's called the diagonal opposition, because the two kings are 2 squares apart down a diagonal instead of along a file. And you will see that whatever black does, white can keep the ordinary opposition after this. So if he plays king to king 2, for example, white plays king to king 5, and we've got back to a position we had before. So as long as white keeps either the straightforward opposition or the diagonal opposition, there's nothing black can do to defend this position. Now let's go back to diagram 5 again and consider what would happen if it's white's turn to move. I implied just now that this is a draw because I said that white mustn't lose the opposition. And in fact it is a draw, but white has some tricks available. Let's see if you can defend it for black. For white, I play king to bishop 4. What do you reply? Stop the tape while you think about it. If you played king to bishop 3, you're okay. You've kept the opposition. But if you played king to queen 4, attacking the pawn, you've fallen into my trap. We'll just have a look at that one. If black plays king to queen 4, white now plays king to king 3. And now if black moves his king back to king 3, white plays king to king 4, getting back to the original position, but with black to move. So I would then win. So after the moves played, I played king to bishop 4, and you played king to bishop 3. Now I play king to knight 4. What do you play against this? Again, stop the tape while you think about it. Well, if you played king to knight 3, you've kept the opposition, but you moved your king too far away from the pawns, because now I just play pawn to queen 5, and if you play pawn takes pawn, the other pawn queens, because the king can't step into the square. When the other pawn gets to bishop 6, the king can't step into that little square, because he would need to get to the king file in one move, which he can't do. So king to knight 3 is no good by black. Instead, you must play king to king 3. And now the white king can't stay too far away from his queen pawn, so white must move the king back to bishop 4. And now black just moves back to bishop 3, repeating position and keeping the opposition. But we haven't finished yet. Now I'm going to play king to king 3. What do you play against that? Again, stop the tape while you think about it. The point of this move was that you can't keep the opposition by king to king 4, because I have a pawn attacking that square. If you move to a white square, I can immediately gain the opposition. So you only have one move, king to king 2. And you now have what's known as the long distance opposition. Instead of being 2 squares apart, the kings are now 4 squares apart, but the effect is the same. Wherever I move, you can keep the opposition. For example, if I move to king 4, you just move your king to king 3. If instead I move to queen 3, you can play king to queen 2, keeping the long distance opposition, and so on. So now you know about the long distance opposition, which also comes up quite frequently. Now let's consider some positions with equal pawns. As I've already said, king and pawn endings are less likely to be drawn than endings with pieces on the board, and even with equal pawns, an apparently small advantage often leads to a win. Such a winning advantage normally takes the form either of the better king position or of a passed pawn. A passed pawn, particularly an outside passed pawn, can often deflect the opposing king away from the defence of his other pawns and allow your king to get in and take them. Have a look at diagram 6. White is to the move. Stop the tape, set the diagram up, and decide what the result should be. Well, this is a fairly easy one. White wins by virtue of his outside passed pawn on the queen's rook file. While the black king is stopping that, the white king just goes in and takes black's pawns on the king's side. White has 2 ways of winning actually, but they both come to much the same thing. The most obvious way of doing it is to just simply advance the queen's rook pawn. White plays pawn to rook 5. Black must try to stop it, so he plays king to bishop 3. White then plays pawn to rook 6. Black plays king to knight 3. And now the white king gets in with king to queen 5. Black plays king takes pawn. White plays king to king 6. And now the black pawns can attempt a suicide mission, but it doesn't quite work. If black plays pawn to bishop 4, white just exchanges pawns with pawn takes pawn by black, and then king takes pawn. And you'll see that white is able to take the king's rook pawn and get his king back to the knight file before the black king can get across to stop the rook pawn queening. So that's one way of winning. Go back to diagram 6 and I'll show you the other way. The other method is to first break up the kingside pawns by pawn to king's rook 5, because this makes it easier for the white king to get at them. After this move, black must allow white his king bishop 5 square. So supposing he exchanges pawns, pawn takes pawn by white. Again, black must go for the queen's rook pawn with his king, and meanwhile the white king just takes the king bishop pawn followed by the king's rook pawn and then queens the pawn. It's interesting that this position should be such an easy win, because if you had the rooks on the board in diagram 6, it would be drawn. Supposing you put the rooks on some sort of random squares. Let's put the white rook on queen's bishop 4, for example, and a black rook on queen's rook 4. Black can draw this fairly easily, but since this is a tape about king and pawn endings, I won't go into the details here. I just wanted to illustrate the point that you have more winning chances without the pieces on the board than with them. Now have a look at diagram 7. Black is to move. Stop the tape while you set the diagram up and have a look at it. What did you make of this one? Although black has an outside passed pawn, this time white wins, and this is a fairly clear illustration of the strength of a protected passed pawn, because white's pawn on Queen's Bishop 5 is unassailable. Black can never take the knight pawn or even attack it, because as soon as his king gets to Queen's Bishop 5, the bishop pawn just goes through and queens. This is similar to the diagram we had before, diagram 2, where there were two connected passed pawns, which can never be taken by the opposing king. Meanwhile, the white king can go after the king-knight pawn. Supposing black starts with king to bishop 4. White now plays king to bishop 3, keeping the opposition. Now note that black can never go out of the square of white's queen's bishop pawn, and that square has its corners at queen bishop 5, queen bishop 8, king bishop 8, and king bishop 5. So this means that the black king can never go to the king knight file. So instead, if he plays king to bishop 3, white plays king to knight 4, and now the king must move away from defending the knight pawn, after which white just takes it and wins easily. Just for a moment, let's put the white king back on bishop 3 and the black king on bishop 4. So that was if black played his king back to bishop 3. If instead he plays pawn to knight 5 check, white plays king to knight 3. And again, the black king has got to either move away from the pawn or move out of the square. So that position's a win for white. Now let's look at an example of a race. A common type of king and pawn ending is where both sides are advancing pawns on opposite wings, and it's just a question of who gets there first. This time the opposition doesn't come into it. The number of pawns on each side doesn't even matter very much. The vital factor is time. You can sacrifice all your pawns except the one which queens, if this enables you to get there first. Have a good look at diagram 8, because it's not easy. White is to move. Stop the tape and set it up. This position comes from a game between two old masters, Stalberg and Tartakova. Actually, according to Scandinavian sources, the correct pronunciation of the player known to the world as Stalberg should be Stolberry or something like that, but I'm sure he wouldn't have minded me calling him by his anglicised pronunciation. Anyway, at first sight, black has the advantage because he's a pawn up, he has 3 passed pawns, and apparently the better king position. White only has 2 potential passed pawns. The queen pawn is already passed, and he can create another one by advancing his rook pawn to rook 6. But white has one thing in his favour. His passed pawns are going to be fairly far apart, so the black king won't be able to stop both of them, whereas black's passed pawns are all next to each other. So the white king can stop, or at least delay, all of them at once, by getting to queen knight 2, for example. Let's see how it goes. White, to move, has got to start creating his other passed pawn, so he plays pawn to rook 4. Black can't ultimately stop these pawns with his king, so he must counter-attack by advancing his queenside pawns, and black played pawn to rook 4. White continues with pawn to rook 5, and black also plays pawn to rook 5. Now white was able to stop that pawn, at least temporarily, by moving his king into the square of that pawn by playing king to queen 2. So now black can't get anywhere with just the rook pawn, he's got to bring up reinforcements. So he played pawn to knight 4. What would you play for white now? Stop the tape while you think about it. If you played pawn to queen 5 check, well done. You've found Stahlberg's move, which leads to a win for white. But the audio chess team of analysts has found a simpler win by pawn to rook 6. So 10 out of 10 if you got that. Both moves have the same idea of forcing a pawn through, but the advantage of playing pawn to rook 6 first is that black can't play pawn to rook 6 himself, because then white plays pawn takes pawn and will queen with check. So, in reply to pawn to rook 6 by white, black must play pawn takes pawn. And now white plays pawn to queen 5 check. This pawn can't be taken, of course, because the other pawn queens. So black moves his king to bishop 3, temporarily stopping both of the pawns. But white continues with pawn to queen 6. And now the black king can't take the pawn because the queen pawn will queen in 2 moves. So all he can do is try to counter-attack by continuing his own pawn advance with pawn to rook 6. Now white plays pawn to queen 7, threatening to queen with check, so black must play king to king 2. White now plays pawn to knight 7. Black can't do much about that, so he plays pawn to rook 7. But now white queens with check, he plays pawn to queen 8, queening. Black must take it, and now he queens the other pawn with check, and then he can easily stop the pawn on rook 7 by playing queen to queen rook 8 next move, and so white wins the game. The actual game was much more tricky than that, because black's pawns advanced rather further. That is, the knight pawn and bishop pawn were sort of getting up and supporting the rook pawn, and white only just managed to hold them up with his king while he forced a queen for himself. If you want to have a look at that, after Stahlberg's move pawn to queen 5 check, black played king to queen 2. So you can work out how white wins after that if you want to. I'll leave that up to you. So it's really quite surprising that the original position was won for white, and it just shows how careful you have to be when pawn races are involved. Now for a position with more pawns on the board. We're going on to diagram 9 now, in which white is to play. Set it up and try and work out how white can win. Stop the tape while you do so. Well, the obvious move for white is king to king 3, but this doesn't get anywhere because black just plays king to king 4, and then white can't make any further progress, so he's got to be a bit more subtle than that. Instead, the winning method is for white to start off by moving his king to the side, either queen 2 or bishop 2. Let's supposing he played king to queen 2. Now the point of this position is that black has only one square from which to get to king 4, whereas white has more than one square from which to get to king 3. So white wastes a move with king to queen 2. Now if black plays king to king 4, white plays king to king 3, and black has to move back again, so white wins the pawn. After king to queen 2 by white, if instead of king to king 4 black plays anything else, then he can no longer protect the pawn. If he plays king to bishop 3, for example, white just plays king to king 3 and takes the pawn next move. So, whatever black does, white wins the king pawn. And after that he has an easy win, because he's got an extra pawn on the queen side. So all he has to do is make a passed pawn over there and then rush over and take the king side pawns while the black king is stopping white's queen side pawn. So that was a fairly simple example. The point of it was to illustrate a maneuver which is called triangulation. White moves his king in a triangle, and by doing this he wastes a move, and unless his black is able to do the same, he can't maintain the equilibrium, and in this position black can only move his king up and down in a straight line. He can't move it round in a triangle, so white is able to gain by this, as you saw in the position. So this triangulation is a very common maneuver, which is well worth watching out for, particularly when the both kings are a little bit hemmed in by pawns, as they are here. The black king is so hemmed in by pawns that he hasn't got enough freedom of action to copy white's triangular maneuver. Right, that's the end of this side. Now I'll turn over to side 2. Now for another example from practical play. We're going on to diagram 10. Stop the tape while you set up the position and have a good look at it. White is to move. This position occurred in a tournament in Denmark early in 1978, in which I was playing. White is the Danish player Rosenlund, and black is the Hungarian international master Reiner. The position is very much more difficult than it looks at first sight. I don't suppose you will have seen very deeply into it yet, but I hope you've realised that, for a start, white must abandon his queen-knight pawn and play to create a passed pawn on the king's side instead. First of all, let's see what happens if white does try to protect his queen's knight pawn. If he plays king to bishop 3, black plays king to queen 4, white plays king to knight 4, black plays king to bishop 3, white plays king to rook 5, protecting the pawn, but then black plays king to bishop 4, and now the white king can no longer keep protecting the pawn. He must move back, because of course he can't move any of his pawns on the king's side. So that plan doesn't work. It only results in losing the knight pawn, so we've got to give that up and try something else. Stop the tape while you reset diagram 10. Instead, white played the best move, king to king 2, threatening to create a passed pawn by pawn to bishop 3, followed by a pawn to king 4. After this, white has winning chances if black plays carelessly. What would you play for black? Stop the tape while you think about it. I hope you played king to queen 4, because that's the best move. It combines going for the queen-knight pawn with keeping an eye on the centre in case something unexpected happens. The alternative, king to queen 3, is not quite so good, as we shall see later. But after king to queen 4, white must now play pawn to bishop 3. Now if black exchanges pawns, the white king is going to be nearer to winning the king's bishop pawn. So it looks right for black not to exchange pawns, but to go straight for the queen's knight pawn by playing king to bishop 4. After this, what do you play for white? Stop the tape while you think about it. The correct move now for white is pawn to king 4, undermining the base of black's pawn chain. We'll look at that in a moment. But first of all, let's see what happens if white makes a mistake of playing pawn takes pawn. Black recaptures with pawn takes pawn, and now white can't easily get at the king knight pawn, and black wins by virtue of his outside passed pawn. Let's see how it goes. White can't now continue with pawn to king 4, because against that black would just play king to queen 5 and win the pawn. So white must bring his king round with king to queen 3. Black then plays king takes pawn. And now white must continue to move his king round. If instead he plays pawn to king 4, then black would just play king to bishop 4. And we've got into a normal sort of outside passed pawn position, where the white king will have to stop the knight pawn while the black king takes both the white pawns on the king side. So instead of that, and the white pawn is still on king 3, and the black king is still on knight 3, white plays king to king 4. Black now plays king to bishop 4. Now, if white continues with king to bishop 5, so as to leave the way clear for his own pawn to advance, you will see, without actually making the moves on the board, that the black pawn will queen with check, and so black will win that by a tempo. So king to bishop 5 is no good. Instead, if white tries to grab the other pawn by playing king to bishop 4, black advances his pawn with pawn to knight 4. Now white plays pawn to king 4. Black plays pawn to knight 5. White plays pawn to king 5. Now if the pawns keep going, they're going to queen simultaneously. Black continues with pawn to knight 6. White plays pawn to king 6. But of course, instead of continuing to queen his pawn, black now comes back with his king, plays king to queen 3, stopping the white pawn, and his pawn is then going to queen, so black wins the position. So let's go back to the position where white should have played pawn to king 4. To get to that, first of all reset diagram 10, stopping the tape while you do so. From the diagram, the moves have gone king to king 2 by white, king to queen 4, pawn to bishop 3, king to bishop 4. Now, instead of exchanging pawns, white should have played pawn to king 4 immediately. So white plays pawn to king 4. Now, black can't take the king pawn, because after pawn takes king pawn, white then plays pawn takes knight pawn. And now white's got the outside passed pawn, and he wins by rushing up with his knight pawn. Black hasn't then got time to take the queen's knight pawn and still stop the pawn. So after pawn to king 4, black must first of all play pawn takes bishop pawn check. White takes it back, king takes pawn. Then black plays pawn takes the other pawn check, and white plays king takes pawn. And now black takes the other pawn, king takes pawn. Now what happens? Well, white tries to queen his pawns. He plays pawn to knight 4. Black's got to get his king out of the way of the pawn and also stand a chance of getting it back, so he plays king to bishop 3. Now black is threatening to get his king back to stop the pawn and draw, so if he's trying to win, white must now play king to king 5, trying to keep the black king cut off. Now if black starts advancing his pawn, you will see that the white pawn is going to get there first. In fact, they're both going to queen simultaneously, but then after that white will be able to play queen to queen's bishop 8 check, driving the king to the knight file, and then queen to knight 8 check, picking up the black queen. So white would win if black did that. So that was if black tried pawn to knight 4. So the position we've got is the black pawn is still on knight 2, the black king is on bishop 3, the white king is on king 5, and the white pawn is still on knight 4. And black, instead of pawn to knight 4, must continue to move his king back with king to queen 2. In order to try and keep the king out of it, white must now play king to bishop 6. But now black can afford to rush up with his pawn, because after both sides queen, white no longer has a way of picking up the queen, so that is a draw. So now let's go back to diagram 10 again. Stop the tape while you set it up. After the moves we started off with, king to king 2 by white, king to queen 4 by black, I think the analysis I've just gone through demonstrates that black has a clear draw. But you can try and disprove this if you think I haven't covered everything. In the game, however, Reiner played a careless move. Instead of king to queen 4, he played king to queen 3, thinking that it didn't make any difference. It doesn't look as if it makes any difference. But in fact, Rosenlund found a tricky reply by white. Can you see what it is? Stop the tape while you look at it. He played pawn to bishop 4. This has the same idea as pawn to bishop 3, of creating a passed pawn by playing pawn to king 4 next move. But it gains a tempo, because the pawn has got to bishop 4 in one move instead of 2. Notice that this wouldn't have worked if black had played his king to queen 4 instead of queen 3, because he would then be able to get the king to king 5, after which black is actually winning, because the white king is forced to move to the side, and the black king can just force his way in and win the white's kingside pawns, surprisingly. So, with his king still on queen 3, black was now in difficulties after pawn to bishop 4 by white. Reiner was obviously taken by surprise by this move, and from looking rather confident just previously, he now went into a rather deep huddle, looking worried. I stood there watching for about 5 minutes, trying to see what was going on, and I decided white was winning. So I went off to have lunch, since this was being played in the morning because it was an adjournment session. I had lunch with the Finnish Grandmaster Westerinen and the Norwegian player Helmers, who were also playing in the tournament. We looked at the position on a pocket set, and analysed a few lines and agreed that it was one for white. So you can imagine that we were rather surprised on returning to the tournament hall and finding that the game had ended in a draw. Now I'll go through the variations and show you what happened, and where our analysis went wrong. But the reason for telling this story was to demonstrate how tricky an apparently simple king and pawn ending can be, such that the right continuation is not obvious even to grandmasters. Now let's get on to the analysis. After pawn to bishop 4 by white, black has two plausible continuations. He can either play king to bishop 4, going for the queen's knight pawn, or he can play pawn takes pawn en passant, check. First of all, let's try looking at king to bishop 4. White now plays pawn to king 4 in order to create a passed pawn. What should black do now? Should he continue with king takes pawn, or should he first play pawn takes pawn? Stop the tape while you think about this one. Well, if black plays king takes pawn, this loses because white just then plays pawn takes pawn. He could also play pawn to king 5, by the way, but we'll look at pawn takes pawn because this continuation following this is very instructive. White's king must now go over to stop the queen's knight pawn. The black king must take white's leading bishop pawn, which is now on bishop 5. We don't have to look at the exact moves, but because often in king and pawn endings you can think in terms of general plans, you know, supposing the king rushes right over there, and supposing the opposing king rushes right over there. So, having done this, the black king will then get to king 5, and there's no good just sitting there and waiting for the white king to come back, so he'll have to play it into bishop 6 and take the white's knight pawn, allowing the bishop pawn to queen, and then trying to queen his own knight pawn. And if you count up the tempi, you'll see that by the time white does queen, black will have taken the knight pawn and got his pawn to knight 7. But queen against knight pawn on the 7th is a win. It doesn't really matter where the white king is, because he can always bring that back. And in king and pawn endings, it frequently happens that one side queens while the other side gets his last pawn to the 7th, and so you should know that this is a win where the pawn is a knight pawn or a central pawn, but a draw against a bishop pawn or rook pawn. That is assuming that the king is not near enough to really influence matters. The reason it's a draw with the bishop pawn or rook pawn is because the defender has stalemate possibilities. But this tape is really about king and pawn endings, so I'll leave you to try those endings out for yourself if you're not familiar with them, and you'll see that it's true that against a bishop pawn or a rook pawn, black can manage to draw with stalemate ideas. So let's go back now to where we left off. Starting from diagram 10, set that position up again. Stop the tape while you do so. We started with king to king 2 by white, king to queen 3, pawn to bishop 4, king to bishop 4, and then pawn to king 4 by white. Now we've decided that king takes pawn is no good for black, so instead he must play pawn takes pawn. White now continues with king to king 3. Now it's no good for black to try protecting that pawn with king to queen 4, because white will then just advance his bishop pawn to bishop 5, and then black will have to take that. White will take the king pawn, and then the white king will be better placed, so he'll be able to take the knight pawn and win. So it's no good protecting the pawn. The position we've got is the black king still on queen's bishop 4, and the white king is on king 3. Instead, black must take the queen's knight pawn with king takes pawn, and white plays king takes pawn himself. And this reaches the position which is shown in diagram 11. I've used a diagram for it because it's very interesting, and we'll be going back to it a few times. It looks easy, but in fact it's not. It's quite difficult. Should black play king to bishop 4 or king to bishop 3, he's obviously got to play one of those in order to get out of the way of his pawn and move his king towards the centre of the board. Stop the tape while you think about which one he should move to. Well, it's not easy, but I reckon that king to bishop 3 is a clear draw. After this, similar to the position we had a little while ago, what white is trying to do is to cut the black king off from stopping his bishop pawn. So white plays king to king 5. But now black can force a draw by playing pawn to knight 4, in order to force white to commit himself by advancing his pawn. And once his pawn has advanced one square, then it's no longer supported by the other pawn. So if white now plays pawn to bishop 5, black can then play king to queen 2, getting his king back and winning the pawn while white is winning the other pawn. So now let's go back to diagram 11. Stop the tape while you reset the position. After king to bishop 3 by black, and then we played king to king 5 for white, and black played pawn to knight 4. Supposing white tries to win the queen knight pawn by coming back with his king, by playing king to queen 4. Now you'll notice this is similar to a position we had before in diagram 7, but there's an important difference. The white pawns are one square further back on the king side than they were before. As a result, it's that much easier for the black king to stay inside the square of the king's bishop pawn. He can hang around on queen knight 3 and queen's bishop 3 and get back to stop the bishop pawn as soon as it makes a dash for the queening square. Notice in this sort of line that white can take the queen knight pawn while black is taking the king bishop pawn, and then the white king can come across and force the win of the king knight pawn. But this doesn't help, because as soon as white plays king takes pawn, that is the king knight pawn, black then just plays king to knight 3 with the opposition, and reaching a drawn position which we've looked at right at the beginning of the tape. So go back to diagram 11 again. We'll look at another idea. We've seen that king to bishop 3 by black draws. But what about king to bishop 4? Doesn't look as if it makes much difference. What should white play against this? Stop the tape while you think about it. Well, there's an important difference here. White plays king to king 5. Now, if both the pawns start advancing, then the white pawn is going to queen with check. So black must play his king back to bishop 3, again threatening to get his king round in front of the white bishop pawn. White now plays king to king 6, still keeping the black king out. Again, if the both pawns advance to queening, white is going to have the same trick with playing queen to bishop 8 check and winning the black queen. So black must continue by moving his king back again to bishop 2, again threatening to get it round with king to queen 1. And white keeps cutting it off by playing king to king 7. And now the pawns do both start advancing. They both queen. But, so if you make those moves on the board, black has just queened, and then after white had already queened. And now white can play queen to king bishop 4 check, picking up the king's knight pawn, so ending up with queen and pawn against queen, which is in fact a theoretical draw, but you wouldn't fancy defending it, would you? I just thought this was rather an amusing line with the two kings chasing each other up the board like that. And so although that does draw, it's not quite so convincing as if black had played king to bishop 3 instead of king to bishop 4. So now we're going right back to diagram 10, because there's another main line which we haven't considered yet. Stop the tape and reset diagram 10. After king to king 2 by white, king to queen 3, pawn to bishop 4. The move which was played in the game was not king to bishop 4, but the other plan of pawn takes pawn check. But before you make that move, let me just point out that if instead black changed his mind and moved the king back to queen 4, trying to stop white getting a passed pawn, white will then play king to queen 3. Then the black king would have to move away to bishop 4, and then white gets pawn to king 4, which is similar to a line we've looked at before, except white's a tempo up. And so this makes the difference that white is going to stand winning chances now, but let's see how it goes. After pawn to king 4, black now plays pawn takes pawn check, and white plays king takes pawn, and then black plays king takes pawn. Now this looks pretty similar to the position we had just now in diagram 11, but it's white to move, and white can win quite easily. Stop the tape while you try and see how he does this. Well, the answer is that he has a time to take the king's knight pawn. He plays king to bishop 5. And now white's got two possibilities. He can either take the knight's pawn or move his king away to king 6 and then queen his bishop pawn. So that's why black mustn't play king to bishop 4, because that is a bad square for his king to be on, because when white queens the bishop pawn it will be check. So instead black plays king to bishop 3. But now, instead of trying to queen his pawn, white takes the other pawn, and now he's able to get his king back. If black now plays pawn to knight 4, white plays king to bishop 3, and you'll note that he's then stepping into the square of that knight pawn, so he's able to get his king back and stop it. And so then of course he wins quite easily. So just having cleared up that minor line, let's now get back to the game. Stop the tape and reset diagram 10. After king to king 2, king to queen 3, pawn to bishop 4, pawn takes pawn, check, king takes pawn. What should black do now? Should he go for the queen's knight pawn, or should he try and defend with king to king 4? Stop the tape while you think about this. Well, taking the queen's knight pawn now loses, because having exchanged pawns, the white king is that bit more active, and he can get at the bishop pawn more quickly. So let's see how that line goes. If black plays king to bishop 4, white plays king to bishop 4, black plays king takes pawn, and white plays king takes pawn. Now black plays king to bishop 4, and you'll notice that now the white king is on bishop 5, which will be checked by the black pawn when it queens. So white can't simply advance his pawn. Instead, he has a cunning move. He plays king to king 4, threatening to get the king back and stop the knight pawn. So in order to keep the white king out, black must cut it off with king to bishop 5. But now white has enticed the black king onto a square where it will be checked by the knight pawn when it queens. So white just then advances his pawn and queens with check, and there's nothing black can do against that. So that was no good. In order to get back to the game, I'll start you off again from diagram 10. Stop the tape while you reset that. The moves played were once again king to king 2, king to queen 3, pawn to bishop 4, pawn takes pawn, check, king takes pawn, and now we've just seen that black doesn't achieve anything by going for the queen knight pawn. He must come back and defend with his king, and he plays king to king 4. Now this is quite complicated, but white only has one way to make progress immediately. It's no good playing pawn to knight 4, because then black would just exchange the pawns and then win the king pawn, and he would then be able to get his king back in time to win the queen's knight pawn as well. So white doesn't play pawn to knight 4. Instead, the only way to do anything is for white to play pawn to king 4, sacrificing a pawn in order to create an outside pass pawn. Black must take it, pawn takes pawn, check, and white plays king to king 3. Now, which way should the king go? To queen 4 or bishop 4? Stop the tape and try and decide. Well, king to bishop 4 is no good, because then white plays king to queen 4, and you'll notice the king has to move away from protecting the pawn. So you might as well go to take the white pawn with king to knight 5. White plays king takes pawn, and black plays king takes pawn. But then, this time white wins the race over to the queen side, because he can get his king into knight 7, taking the black pawn and queening his own pawn. So let's replace the white king on king 3, the white pawn on king's knight 3, the black king on king 4, and the black pawn on king 5. So that was if black played king to bishop 4, which loses. So instead he must play king to queen 4. White can't now play king to bishop 4, because black would then play king to queen 5, after which his pawn would have a clear run through to queen. So instead, white must play pawn to knight 4. Black obviously must play king to king 4. White only has one way of making progress, pawn to knight 5. Now black plays king to bishop 4. White plays pawn to knight 6. Black takes it, and white takes black's pawn. And again we've got a race between the two kings over to the queen side, but this time the black king can get back to queen's bishop 1, because he's starting the race this time from knight 3 instead of knight 5, and so it's a draw. So you'll see that it's very important exactly where these kings start off when they go into this race, and that's the sort of critical factor in this particular part of the ending. But the game went differently from this. Return to the position with the white king on king bishop 3, his pawns on king 3 and king's knight 3, the black king on king 4 and his pawn on king bishop 4. Now white played pawn to king 4, black played pawn takes pawn check. But in the game, white found a subtle try. Instead of playing king to king 3, he played king to king 2. What would you play now for black? Stop the tape and think about it. The move white was hoping for now was king to bishop 4, which looks most obvious. But then white plays king to king 3, black plays king to king 4, and white plays pawn to knight 4, reaching a position we had in the previous line, but the difference being that it's black to move instead of white, because white has wasted a move by triangulating with his king. He moved it to king 2 and then to king 3. Black in this position must keep his king protecting the pawn, so he must play king to queen 4. White then plays pawn to knight 5, black plays king to king 4, white plays pawn to knight 6, black plays king to bishop 3, king takes pawn, and now king to king 5 by white, and this time white wins the race to the queen side. Very tricky, all these races. So we'll go back to the position I just asked you about. The white king was on king 2, his pawn was on knight 3. The black king was on king 4, and his pawn was on king 5. To avoid falling into that line, black must move his king to a square such that if white plays king to king 3, he will then be able to play king to queen 4, not king to king 4, because with the king on queen 4, that will be a drawn position which we've already looked at. In the game, black chose king 3, keeping the long distance opposition, but as far as I can see, king to queen 5 or king to queen 3 instead would also have drawn, because if white then plays pawn to knight 4, black can still play his king to queen 4, getting back to lines we've just looked at. So after black played king to king 3, now white's got to think what he's going to do. Now king to king 3 by white is no good, because again black plays king to queen 4. So white tried king to queen 2, still sort of hanging around waiting to get to king 3. But black was also able to hang around. He just played king to queen 3, again keeping the long distance opposition. Well, this wasn't getting white very far, so he tried advancing his pawn with pawn to knight 4. Now again, black must be careful not to move his king to king 4, because then white would play king to king 3, and black would have to move his king away to queen 4, which is a line we've just seen wins for white. So instead of king to king 4, black played king to queen 4. So that if white now plays king to king 3, black can again play king to king 4, getting back to the position which draws. But instead of king to king 3, white played king to king 2. But again, it's a similar sort of thing. Black mustn't put his king on king 4, because white then plays king to king 3. But instead, black just hangs around with king to king 3, waiting for white to play king to king 3, so that he can then play king to king 4 when it will be white's turn to move. So after king to king 3 by black, white's now continued delaying matters by playing king to bishop 2. Well, but that didn't really set black any problems. He just played king to bishop 3. White moved the king back to king 2, repeating position, and black also played king to king 3. And by this stage, Reiner has demonstrated that he knows how to draw the position, and so Rosenlund agreed to draw. So that completes, I think, the analysis of this position. But to recap on it all, let's return once more to diagram 10, so that we can just see how the analysis went. Stop the tape and set up diagram 10. White played king to king 2. Now, if black had played king to queen 4, he would have drawn quite comfortably. Instead, he actually played king to queen 3. If then white had played pawn to bishop 3, king to bishop 4 would draw quite comfortably for black, although pawn takes pawn check also draws with slightly more difficulty. But after pawn to bishop 4 is played in the game, black can still just about draw with king to bishop 4, but instead in the game he chose pawn takes pawn check, which also just manages to draw. And so in both of these last two lines, Westerine, Helmers and I overlooked the drawing line. So you can see that with correct play all the main lines draw, but there are plenty of opportunities for black to go wrong, which is what made the analysis so interesting. And I think this is a very instructive example from practical play. I've tried to analyse the position out to the end, but there are so many tricks in the air that I wouldn't be surprised if I've made a mistake or two somewhere. So you're welcome to try and look for one. And if you do analyse this position thoroughly, as I did, I guarantee that you'll learn a lot about king and pawn endings. I certainly did. And if you want to try a little bit more experimentation, you could try moving all the pawns up by one square, either on the king side pawns or the queen side pawns, just to see what difference it makes. And no doubt that will give you a bit of analysis to do after that. But I leave that to you. Yeah. But before I leave you, I'm going to leave you with a problem. We haven't looked at diagram 13 yet. That position is black to play, and it's quite an interesting one, and I'm going to leave you to do your own analysis on that. And I'm not going to tell you what the result is, so you'll have to work it out for yourself. But if you can't decide what the result should be, or if you want to check your analysis, if you want it verified, write into Audio Chess, and we will either check your analysis or tell you what it should have been. So that will give you something to be going on with. Cheerio.